I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. As a CEO, there are days when my calendar feels like a never-ending cascade of decisions, meetings, and problems to solve. Days when I can't remember if I've eaten lunch. The last thing I have time to think about is currency exposure. This is where Alt21 can help by taking the complexity out of foreign exchange. With their FX and hedging platform, you can lock in exchange rates and automate payments. And with their low fees, up to 90% less than competitors, you'll save money while freeing up your time for what really matters. If you want to stop juggling and start focusing on growing your business, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Neural. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Pamela Dow, chaired the government's Inclusion at Work panel, which recently published its recommendations for improving diversity and inclusion practice in the workplace. She is Chief Operating Officer at Civic Future, an educational initiative identifying and supporting the next generation of public leaders. Formerly, Pamela was Executive Director of the Cabinet Office, Director of Development at the Ministry of Justice, and Principal Private Secretary at the Department of Education. She's currently working on a book based on her viral article in the New Statesman, HR Britain, How Human Resources Captured the Nation. Pamela, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Ollie, it's lovely to be invited and to see you. You've been such a source of generosity and wisdom over 10 years of my career, I think, and I always look forward to chatting.
Oh, well, I feel the opposite is true. Every time I speak with you, I learn a huge amount. You, in 2024, chaired the UK's government's Inclusion at Work panel, which published a report on improving workplace diversity and inclusion. I'd love to hear, with the benefit of a bit of distance now, what your key takeaways were from that you think board members listening should understand.
So a quick recap of the context, because it was actually, I think it was just in 2023 that the then Secretary of State for Business and Trade and Minister of Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, where's she now? And she asked me to chair an independent panel to consider the efficacy and value for money of diversity and inclusion practice. And the reason that she asked me was because at that time I was in the UK Cabinet Office in charge of training and skills of civil servants and the Leadership College. I don't have domain expertise in D&I, but that was the relevance to me being involved in that panel. And her aim at that time was to help senior leaders in all sectors, because obviously she had the equalities brief, but also the trade and industry brief in the government. She was thinking about the public sector and the private sector. So to help senior leaders in all sectors make informed choices. And I think given the news over the last couple of weeks across the Atlantic, she was quite prescient in trying to avoid further polarization of what was increasingly kind of tricky and sensitive debate. We got together a panel, people with much more expertise in diversity and inclusion than me, and heard from hundreds of people and organisations from across sectors, charities, businesses, government bodies and activists. We considered trends, changes in the last few years, and we assessed what the available evidence was for interventions in the workplace. And I think in terms of boards who are thinking about this, the reassuring themes from everyone we spoke to, every sort of submission we received from people was that there is a thin consensus that we can all unite around, that the ultimate aims of equality of opportunity, a true meritocratic institution, rewarding excellence, fairness, workplaces that everyone could contribute to and realise their potential, everyone was behind that. And that more than that, wanted to have good faith conversations about how to achieve those things. Everyone really wanted to understand unfairness and what lay behind disparities in outcomes and, where discrimination was present, if it was. A pleasing thing that I look back and we probably didn't make enough of at the time was that people were coming to this conversation very particularly at board level or senior executive level, really committed to them and their organisation giving back the advantage they'd had to help others and the next generation. More concerningly, though, there was definitely a sense that many people, managers, senior leaders in particular, were scared of saying or doing the wrong thing. of getting equality legislation wrong or policies wrong. And I think More in Common have got some really interesting data on that as well. People around that time, and I think still, are really worried about this topic, risk of getting cancelled, whatever it might be. The other thing was the increase in money, time, efforts devoted to D&I within organisation, both kind of creation of roles, but also buying interventions in or just having practices as part of the organisation's DNA were increasing, but without any sort of correlation with value for money evaluation or anything like that. We have to remember that this was 2023, and we may go on to cover this. There was a particular moment, wasn't there? Another theme was that sort of corporate D&I rhetoric didn't seem to be correlated with the improvement in persistent disparities or bad practice. So you had more and more performative activity, but not really any sort of credible evidence of impact. And then more and more, obviously this is what we were asking people to bring to us. So we were obviously seeing this controversial cases where, where there'd been a payout because someone had challenged the use of equality legislation, and that workplace inclusion and team belonging was being undermined by kind of well-meaning but clunkily imposed D&I policy. And we've got a case that's been in the news in the last couple of weeks, haven't we? Is it Eleanor Francis, the civil servant? I don't actually know her, and we didn't hear from her at the time of the panel. Anyone looking at the settlement in that case can see some of the trends that we identified. So our findings were clear data on the efficacy of interventions is either minimal or actually absent. And when we say data, we're talking about the overall cost, the value for money, the impact. The equalities legislation, the Equality Act, the public sector equality duty is often misunderstood and in some cases misapplied. So we recommended we'd do this with my education background, a tool a bit like the Education Endowment Foundation's toolkit, which teachers and head teachers can go to and say, here's a teaching practice, what's the available evidence for it? And then what's the cost of it and likely and chance of making a difference? And you can imagine a version of that for these sorts of D&I things. And actually, ideally, but broader than that. So what does good recruitment really look like? And do we know that? And how do we know that? And what's been the impact? And then something that I think the EHRC have done, which is just a clear explanation of the Equality Act and PSED, public sector equality duty, that explains also that going beyond this is actually breaking the law. There were some organisations and some practice who identified if we've gone further than the Equality Act, well, it means you've gone too far.
At an organisational level, were there common themes that evolve where you saw organisations going wrong with D&I?
Yeah, I think one of them I've just alluded to earlier, the sort of hollow gestures, the photo shoot on LinkedIn, the appointment of allies, the ambassadors for this identity or that identity. The other thing I think is leaving this to just one function, leaving it to the HR function. It's unfair in the HR function, and it's an abdication of your responsibility as a senior leader, saying, oh, we've got a D&I strategy and I'm handing it over to my chief people officer to present it and lead it. Well, that's not human resources. It's about the leadership direction of an organisation. And then on a more kind of prosaic level, not testing what you buy. And that can be taken at a literal level. I remember in the Cabinet Office when we were looking at the training that it was on. This is a bit of a jargon, but anyone who's sold anything to government will know this wording. So the frameworks, the sort of frameworks that you have to be part of and jump through the sort of procurement compliance to get on to provide training for the civil service. In 2021, there were two commercial organisations, two companies that were selling menopause webinars to the Cabinet Office. Not hugely expensive, but still across a large organisation, if people are buying in these webinars, you can easily get up to the amount of the head teacher gets in a year or something like that. And I went on Companies House to have a look at these organisations, and they've been set up in the last year. Completely understandably, there was this sort of movement around menopause awareness in organisations led by Davina McCall, and these companies have seen a gap in the market and started selling this product. Started to look at what the content of the webinar was, and you start to question, well, is this tested? Is it actually saying anything more than just good, thoughtful, empathetic management? And I think that's a sort of small example of thinking, oh, I've got to do something to cover my X flank, and therefore we'll have an event, or we'll have a photo shoot, or we'll have a webinar. And these are complex social things, complex management challenges, and complex opportunity costs. And that's a leadership decision.
You talked earlier about the importance of assessing the effectiveness and value for money of D&I initiatives. What data should boards be asking for? You recommend that there should be a central database evidencing the stuff. There's not yet, to my knowledge. So what, for a board member listening to this now, saying, gosh, what do we do right now in the absence of that, is your best advice?
I'm thinking about this such a lot at the moment. This is almost a test of something that I'm just considering at the moment. And as you say, thinking since my New Statesman article, thinking more and more about, because I think it's an area that I have most changed my mind on in the last 10, 15 years. When we were in education in the sort of 2010 to 2015 period, and thinking it's a bit of a policy meme in Whitehall that sort of more, no system's ever been made worse by shining a light on it. The crucial thing that you can do is just to publish all the data, the raw data in Tableau form, so that people can kind of, data enthusiasts can spot patterns. You might have a couple of days of bad headlines if you're completely transparent, but the transparency leads to good outcomes. And I still stand by that in some cases. So, for example, I will get to the answer to your question. I hope you forgive me for just thinking out loud, Ollie. You're used to this, aren't you? So in the case of the NHS, there is this brilliant thing. I've forgotten the chap who led it, but it's called the Model Hospital. And what the Model Hospital, have you come across it?
No, I haven't.
So the Model Hospital is basically a tool. And what it does is it across hundreds of indicators for everything from like how much does the hospital spend on loo roll to how many surgeries are scheduled to what's its wage bill, how many nursing staff has it got versus administrative staff, all of those things. And it produces a sort of perfect, so for every one of these data points, what's the sort of most efficient, most effective, most desirable point? And then any specific hospital, so any board of any hospital or any senior leader can go in and look, where does their data on that particular point relate to the model? I haven't explained it very well, but this sort of virtuous, fictitious hospital, which is the cumulative...
an aggregate benchmark.
An aggregate benchmark, exactly. That's a much better way of saying it. And as I understand it, that is increasingly a brilliant tool. And once people understand that it's not naming and shaming and it's not a league table, they can start to work out. And also it overcomes that issue of you can't compare like for. So a huge urban hospital should not be compared to a Scarborough Hospital near where I grew up in East Riding. They have different populations, they have different needs, but you can start to compare like hospitals. So you can say, well, it is worth comparing how much Scarborough Hospital spends on loo roll compared to how much Great Yarmouth spend, whatever it might be. I don't know that their health as well as I do schools, but it's actually it's not dissimilar from the Progress 8 Ofsted tables. So back in the old days when there were school league tables, it was quite a crude set of measures. It was basically how well did the school do in kind of public exam results. There was a fair criticism of that, which was, hang on a minute, if like my crude exam results at GCSE don't really show how well I'm progressing people, because we don't really know what standard the kids are at year 7. The standard of kids coming in at year 7 in Newham is different from the standard of kids coming in Banbury. So Progress 8 is a package of measures which addresses that. So you can start to identify coasting schools. But again, you can compare so I think if you're a parent and you go on the Ofsted Progress 8 tables now, you can see how well your local school is compared to like schools that have a similar sort of entry. Anyway, there's a very long way of saying I do agree with the sort of more data is useful in those contexts. But in this topic that we're talking about in terms of diversity inclusion, in terms of issues like gender and race, and sexuality, the identity characteristics, the protected characteristics. The change I think that I've gone through, even possibly since the panel, is I think a board or an organisation really ought to have a sense of what problem they're trying to solve before they start thinking what data they need to collect. And that's not to say not be transparent. And it's certainly not to say, let's cherry pick our data. I suppose it's an argument, and this is very informed by Iris Bonet, who was on the panel, her work. She's got a book coming out soon about gender interventions that work. But also Alex Edmonds, who's been on your podcast previously. The scientific method asks us to think what hypothesis and what assumptions we want to test. So in terms of gender, I think a board should think, what are we worried about as an organisation? Are we worried that we don't have enough women at a senior level in this organisation? Do we not have enough women in a certain grade and above if it was the civil service? Okay, let's ask the next question on from that. Have we got enough women applying for those roles? At what point in the career do women seem to stop progressing? Do we not have enough women coming in at entry? Are similarly qualified women not getting the job at entry level, first promotion level, second promotion level, third promotion level? And then you start to get much more granular about where the problems might be. So from the civil service, it is very clear that with some exceptions, MOD is a particularly kind of, some departments have understandably a fewer women in the operational roles and the administrative roles. But say a department like Department for Education, you've got more women at every level and more women being promoted. I think this is true at every level, including SCS. But there is a bit of a drop-off at the sort of child rearing ages, and about wanting to come back into more senior roles. So rather than just think, have we got a gender pay gap problem in the DFE, you start saying, okay, how can we make it easier for parents continue in career progression should they want that? How can we make it easier for people to think about roles that are more suited for those years in terms of that particular individual or that particular family's needs? You start to spot where the actual problems are. But a lot more people more qualified to talk about the gender pay gap reporting kind of context. But the gender pay gap is a really good example of something that can be quite crudely misrepresented for organisations. I often feel a bit sorry for some organisations every year when it's reported, because I think it was Goldman's last year, they'd gone like quite a lot of points down in their sort of crude league table terms of how well they were doing. But if you think about Goldman and its salaries, that could be the cause of just one very senior, well-remunerated woman leaving to go to a different bank. And if you don't know that context, you can't understand, well, has Goldman's actually got a problem here? Or can this year's stats be explained? So when you start asking for gender pay gap statistics in terms of what about our colleagues under 40 compared to our colleagues over 40, or a sectoral level, in the financial sector, is there something different from in the STEM sector or in charities? And then you start thinking about what data you actually want in your organisation. And I think that combination, and I think it's in Alex's book, he gets into this more, or maybe he's done it on a podcast, the combination of data expertise and academic research expertise working together on the scientific method around this is what's needed, because what you don't want is research driven by either direct or indirect, I know what answer I want to find here, so I'll ask the stats the one, versus where I started in this very long answer, data people who just want all the data available and will manipulate it to say a set of things that actually can be taken out of context.
We record Enter the Boardroom in the hope it gives you ideas that can add value to your boardrooms and help unlock non-executive opportunities. If you found it helpful and want more structured board-level learning, development and networking, I'd encourage you to try New Role Plus. Our new 6-month boardroom courses provide structured guidance from senior board members and New Role's board search professionals. Across 12 different events, the course is designed to help you decide which roles to apply for, refine your board CV and profile, network strategically, prepare for chair positions, master applications, and sharpen your board interview skills. To celebrate our milestone of 100,000 Enter the Boardroom downloads, I'm delighted to offer a 10% discount to all our listeners who sign up between now and the end of March. Head to plus.newrole.com and apply the code ENTER, all lowercase, at checkout. Echoes of what Jen Sundberg, the founder of Board Intelligence, said in episode 57, where they see boards most going wrong is when they start getting tied up in data, and that they will always pull them back to is, as you just articulated, what's the question they're trying to answer? Are there organizations that you saw as part of this work who you thought did a really good job on their D&I strategy?
So I knew you were going to ask me this, and I'm not being deliberately evasive. There's two responses to that question. I don't know enough organisations, and I don't think that's for want of people trying to hear from organisations or the people who responded. They're all succeeding in different ways and wanting to promote. Well, we've had some real success with women. We've had some real success with raise. But I don't think any of them reached the level that would have been
the aggregated
enough.
benchmark.
Yeah, exactly, the aggregated benchmark. So I don't really want to name any, but I've been thinking a lot about, one of the recommendations the panel made actually was one of the principles that we recommended. I think we recommended 7 or 8 principles that organisations and boards should think about when they're considering belonging, inclusion, diversity, or this issue generally. And actually, it's worth just mentioning another one because it refers to our previous conversation. Better problem solving. And the evidence that I think is pretty robust now, and Alex talked about this as well, that cognitive diversity and different perspectives in the room is correlated with better problem solving, and therefore you can use that as a proxy for good board decision making or good team decision making, avoiding groupthink essentially.
I think he's digging into that right now as we speak. As in every conversation, not sure the evidence is
not as robust as you think. Okay,
clear as people necessarily make it out to be.
Well, we can intuitively say the opposite. Maybe we can intuitively say that if there is a set of people making big decisions about an organisation and they're all from exactly the same background and they have exactly the same life experiences, it is possible that they might have certain blind spots. So I had a story that sticks in my mind here this isn't a political point. I worked with that government and in many ways they did many good things. There's a story from David Cameron's Number 10 that Linton Crosby was doing the political strategist was doing a presentation about polling and what the country was saying. And he said something like, "And what keeps all of you awake at night?" Because he was just about to say, "What's keeping the country awake at night?" And someone said, "School fees." And it's a good example of, that's probably quite a narrow kind of group of people you've got there. So we can have as a goal that you have a little bit of perspective range in the room. Separately, there are many virtues associated with representation. So if you're in HMP Felton, you're likely to be a young black man in HMP Felton because I think it was 65-70% young black men in the criminal justice system in Felton. If the people you are looking at, the prison officers, the number 1 governors, the board of the prison, anyone who's coming in, if none of them look like you, i.e. if all of them are white, you might have trust issues, you might have kind of legitimate authority issues with the decisions they're making. These are 2 separate things to address. You might choose as an organisation to better represent your clients, your customers, your constituents, whoever that might be. That doesn't necessarily correlate. It sometimes does, but it doesn't necessarily correlate with a range of experience. You could have at the top of a department in Whitehall or at the top of an organisation, a board or a group who all looked exactly the same. So let's say all 50-year-old white women. Some of them might have grown up in care. There might be some gay, some straight. Some might have been grown up in a very poor household in the north, not gone to university. Some might have grown up in Surrey and gone to university. They could be good at perspective and possibly bring in good perspective to problem solving, but not maybe represent everyone they're working with. So it's a very long way of saying that one of the principles of the panel report was to say, when you're thinking about diversity and equality and inclusion, think about both those things when you are doing direct interventions to bring different people into boards or teams. We really wanted to encourage organisations to talk about successes. So at that time, and I think it's still the case, depending on what social media you follow, we are very good, and campaigning groups are very good, and activists are very good at talking about how awful things are. We were both at an event recently, weren't we? The CMI Women's Conference, where there was a lot of discussion of just how terrible things were for women in the workplace. Well, there's always progress to be made. We must always strive for better. But actually, the workplace that I've experienced compared to the workplace my mum experienced, or even just a big sister, is completely different. And when you talk in whatever sector, I can't remember who it was talking about roles for women in TV series and films. Well, I really do think the creative industries have done an amazing job over the last 10 to 15 years on this. So carrots work better than sticks. Showing, not telling stories of success actually creates good behavior because people can see what good things they can do. So I think if I was, rather than saying to a board, here's the organization that's doing a useful D&I intervention here, and we should copy that and lift it into our organization, I think asking the question, this links to your point about psychological well-being, who's got a really good performance story? And in the private sector, that might be profit, shareholder value, whatever it might be. In the public sector, it might be a really good National Audit Office report, whatever it might be. Who seems to be being really effective in accordance with their mission, plus who seems to have really good staff engagement surveys. Now, in civil service, those are publicly available. We all got asked hundreds of questions every year. Each department has very granular knowledge of how happy and belonging its staff are, and can put that against whatever public accounts committee type judgments are being made about that department's success. And then you can start to say, well, this is a successful organisation and its people seem to be pretty happy. So let's have a look at it. And then you get back to the sort of Ofsted Progress 8 or the model hospital, and you have curious minds who aren't being driven by league tables or sticks or joyless reporting on stats out of context. You have people saying, you seem to be doing something really successful. And then you can spot, well, are we worried about that organisation in terms of representation or cognitive diversity? Or does it seem to be actually this organisation which is both high performing and has a good culture? Maybe it's correlated with it has a sports team and a choir. I'm just thinking about Jonathan Haidt's point in the Writer's Mind about the sort of things that actually do make people included aren't the identity networks. They're the fact that they do things all together.
What were the biggest barriers organisations face that you identified when they're trying to implement D&I strategies?
Can I just tell, have we got time for you to tell just a little kind of slightly digression story? I don't know how much time you've got. So I don't know if you know this about me. I'm a very keen knitter. And I have knitted for a long time. Scottish family comes down the female craft line. And just last September, I went to Shetland Islands for Shetland Wool Week, which is the sort of Knitters of the World Unite kind of jamboree every year in the Shetland Islands. And I loved it. I had a wonderful time. If there's anyone from Shetland Wool Week listening, I will go back every year. Next year, I'm planning to go with my mum. You're doing a great thing. It's a great fun event for knitters. But I did notice that this year they have a DEI statement on their website, and it is just the boilerplate statement. We welcome everyone, listed all the things. And again, I think Alex talks about this as well. As soon as, or it might be one of the behavioural economists who does, when you start saying to people, you are welcome if you are this colour, this gender, this disability, you think you're being welcoming, but actually all you've done is make people question, well, I wasn't thinking I wasn't, but now I am. But anyway, it's a standard boilerplate. And it's clearly done by a very well-meaning person. It's incredibly exclusive. First of all, it's on a rock in the middle of the North Sea. I put my bike on the train at Euston. It took me 8 hours to get to Aberdeen. I then had an overnight very rocky crossing to get to the Shetlands. It's not easy to get to. It's inaccessible. Costs quite a lot of money too. So if you are poor or immobile, you're not getting to Shetland all week without help. Secondly, you have more fun at Shetland Wool Week if you can knit. And if you're quite a good knitter, I mean, it's pitched quite high, some of the lectures. Usually that means that you've got matriarchs in your family who've taught you how to do this. There are men who knit, brilliant men who knit. There are people from West and East Africa who knit, again, brilliantly, but mostly women who come from the west coast of Scotland or west coast of Ireland somewhere, because that's the people who knit jumpers because it's really cold. So I think when I was reading this on Shetland Wool Week's website, that a really genuinely inclusive thing for Shetland Wool Week to do would be to say, maybe to focus on a particular bursary. I would have happily paid more for someone who was a really keen knitter but didn't have enough money to get to Shetland to go. That would have been an inclusive activity of Shetland Wool Week. Similarly, this is the sort of goody two-shoes person I am, I would have happily gone to via Fife or wherever it might be to pick up somebody, maybe an older woman, and escort them with me and help them on the ferry, because that would do to allow them to go, because they're probably a better knitter than me and I could have learned a lot from them. Those would have been good inclusive strategies. But actually, in saying that Shetland Wool Week is open to all identities in that sort of boilerplate way, you've actually exposed that it's not. and that you've maybe made yourself more likely to be criticised by maybe even bad faith actors who are going to say, well, it's really posh and white and middle class or whatever. So I don't know, you know what I'm trying to say. I think that the more thought that's put into genuine inclusive and recognizing that some things are by their nature and not kind of with malign intent exclusive, traveling for 24 hours to go to a rock in the middle of the North Sea to knit, recognizing that and doing something else that's not performative might be a really positive and inclusive thing to do.
What a great story. One of the thorny issues that I think boards have been wrestling with for a while now is where they should draw the line on their involvement in political issues. Historically, would never have been involved. More recently, feeling huge pressure to get involved, and many have got involved. What are your thoughts on that?
I actually think this is going to be one of the really big debates in public sector institutions, but to define that really broadly, the sort of institutions that have a sort of public role in some way. So financial institutions in terms of being stewards of our money and lawyers and et cetera. So I think what impartiality means and how you really make sure you're not overstepping the boundaries of what good impartiality looks like is going to be one of the biggest issues of the next couple of years. And actually, as Civic Future, we had a sort of invitation-only event hosted by David Isaacs at Worcester College, ex-Stonewall David Isaacs, just bringing together people. It's also museums. Museums and cultural institutions have got really involved for good and for bad in this question. And it was a really positive day. We had a sort of political theorist talking about what impartiality means in institutions, going right back to first principles and old philosophical conversations. We're such neophiles, us as civilizations. We always think with the first, this is very new, or the DEI is a new challenge. And it's just a different name for usually a very ancient conversation. And I love speaking to young women we're really passionate about feminism and equality, and just saying, oh, have you read kind of Dorothy Sayers on Our Woman Human? Or have you gone back to Mary Wollstonecraft? And, it's reassuring, I think, to know that you're a part of a very long conversation. But in this, impartiality is something that it is new, but you can also draw on old lessons for it. One of the things that's happened in the last couple of years, because of the sort of culture wars, social media, particular things that happened in 2020, 2022, because of that, senior teams have done some quite knee-jerk and ill-thought-through things. When you start thinking, well, something's happened and therefore I'm going to put a flag above my organisation. Well, the moment you've done that, you've raised the question of all future flags. So if an organisation is thinking they're going to send a completely unchallenged virtuous signal by putting up a solidarity with Ukraine flag, well, what happens when someone says on October the 7th, why aren't we flying the Star of David in response to this heinous act? And then, as we know, that debate evolved. Well, okay, what about this flag? What about that flag? And really the answer is government departments, museums, educational institutions just shouldn't be flying flags. That you are going to get yourself into trouble. And I think actually City and Anthony Finkelstein's a brilliant man and mind, and I'm lucky he was a former colleague and lucky to call him a friend now. I think he's actually, I don't know whether maybe you can Google it quickly if you've got your screen open, but he's put out a statement for City University, which is, I think he's one of the first vice chancellors to do so, saying we're not going to comment on events. As an organisation, we are an education organisation. We welcome and actually insist upon the culture of open debate and discussion and tolerance of competing views. But as an organisation, we were not going to comment on events. And I think he's hit upon a form of words that could well be introduced by others. And I definitely think the civil service needs to think about how inadvertently and, well, nobody is behaving with malign intent here, but in well-meaning ways, they've encroached upon the ideology and politics when actually they really shouldn't, and the civil service particularly shouldn't. I suppose what I'm advocating really is the default position should be we don't comment. We don't have an organisational view.
You wrote a piece for the New Statesman titled HR Britain, How Human Resources Captured the Nation, and the article went viral, and you're now developing it into a book. I found your brief history of HR particularly interesting. Could you just set that out for listeners?
There are some wonderful people in human resources in the Cabinet Office. I learned far more from, and across the whole of government, I learned far more from them than they did from me. And actually, linked to the Inclusion at Work panel, some of the people from HR backgrounds, particularly gender equality experts who are, towards the end of their careers, who've been thinking about DEI long before it was called DEI. It were just the sort of the tolerance and good faith and with which they came to conversations was just fantastic. So there were very few people in this camp, but some of the sort of response to it, which saw it as an attack on HR, I was really saddened by, because that's not what it was meant to be. And as someone who's written as well, you don't get to choose your headlines. This sort of trajectory of HR, which as companies started to exist, as institutions started to exist, particularly during the period of industrialization, there had to be some sort of function within an organization that employed greater numbers of people to perform the necessary activity of recruiting people, performance managing people, firing people. That then evolved as more and more policies, sometimes driven by excellent, I'm still in the 18th and 19th century here, some of them driven by excellent campaigners and politicians wanting more employee welfare, or wonderful people like Cadbury. Some of it bottom up, driven by the sort of trade union movement, the little match girls over in Bow Match Factory. So this then evolved into more and more employee welfare, and that necessitated your compliance with policy and people in the organisations who were on the sort of side of making sure that the employee experience was legal and not harmful. And then this, as the sort of 20th century evolved, you get more of the sort of civil rights, equal rights, gender, race coming in, more policy, more legislation, more needs to comply with that policy and legislation. And then that the sort of names of these functions and the power of these functions started to evolve into personnel departments, and they were responsible for the hiring and the firing and the compliance of the organisation. And that, as technology developed, you started to get more and more data about your employees, more and more information and need for more and more actual physical and then digital contracts. So again, that function grew, and they were managing data and they were interpreting data. So then you get into the real sort of hyper growth from the sort of 90s, noughties, 10s, 20s of these functions becoming more and more senior and having more and more influence on organizational strategy and direction. These phrases, you used some of them earlier, psychological safety, employee engagement, these all come from completely kind of legitimate, understandable routes. The people doing MBAs, the business schools, they all emerged in the early 20th century, the same time as economists started to do more and more work on the economy and how products and money and management of money were having an influence in organizations. In parallel, you had people thinking about good stewardship of people, good management of people, and good strategies for dealing with people. So all of these things led towards this sort of increased power and increased influence of that function. And again, that's a very sort of layperson assessment of what's gone on. But when you look at the stats, as I highlighted in the article, that was what really kind of drove me to write it in the way I did. I'm in a world, Civic Future it thinks about one of the policy issues that binds the people who come to us, the people in our fellowship, the people who come to our events. We're non-partisan, we're a charity. We have people from all political backgrounds and none who are working with us and taking part in our programs. But what one of the binding things is a concern about growth, a concern about productivity. And again, the scientific methods tells us that when you see outlier stats, you investigate them, you test assumptions against them. That brilliant Foundations essay recently, the Sam Bowman, Ben Southwood and Samuel Hughes one, looks at what's happening. What are the outlier things in Britain that make us, every Western country struggling with growth and stagnation and productivity at the moment? Britain seems to be doing worse than most. So we've got a planning framework that's not working very well for us. We've got lobbying that's not working very well for us. We've got kind of bits of legislation that need to be mothballed. And I just threw into this pot of outlier stats the fact that we've got this huge growth. The one industry that we're world leading on is creation of HR people and policies. And you've got to start testing that. The intellectually curious people who have got in touch, firstly with their kind of tales of HR woe in their organisation, but also their own sort of interest in looking more into this. have made the link in their head between, well, if there's that sort of level of bureaucracy stopping me hiring the most talented people, rewarding the most talented people, finding the most talented people in the first place, if you know the opportunity cost of in our senior team of focusing on this issue when we could be focusing on something else is linked in some way to our HR policies, well, that's something to address, isn't it?
Pamela, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a quick question and ask you for a short response if you're ready.
Okay.
Best book every board member should read and why?
I am a strong advocate for fiction. If you want to understand human beings, you should read Dickens, you should read Jane Austen. If you really want to be awakened to life in other shoes, there's no better place than fiction.
Favourite quote?
It's from T.S. Eliot's Choruses from the Rock, and it's dreaming of systems so perfect that no one needs to be good.
Most significant professional insight?
Show, don't tell.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
An old boss of mine, and it was in the civil service. Some people will know who it was. He was a good man in many ways. But we were talking about people who performed well in meetings with ministers and people performed less well, because we were thinking about how do you get the most out of people who really know their stuff but clam up in situations with ministers. And this person said, the thing is, Pamela, to do really well in a meeting with a minister, that program QI, you just got to say something quite interesting. And I thought about it afterwards and just thought, that's terrible advice. It really lends itself to that sort of PPE. Oh, here's a nugget or factoid I came up the other day. And then the minister goes, oh, that's an interesting nugget or factoid. And I'll just say it in my next speech. And then you get these sort of memes going around that have no basis in actual rigor. So say something QI is not it's not always a good strategy.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I used to emphasize more that if you're part of a board, you shouldn't be too concerned with the detail of every paper you're receiving. But if you're getting a pack of papers and you're skimming it, and then something like the post office scandal happens or Grenfell, I'm afraid you're on the hook for that. It's on your watch.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Read fiction. No, read Alex Edmond's book. Think about asking what problem you're trying to solve before you start just asking for data or publishing data. I don't know what the third one is. Listen to this podcast. It's excellent.
Pamela, thank you so much for taking the time to share your incredible wisdom and experience.
Not at all. It's been a delight. Thanks, Ollie.